Everybody. So I wanted to start the second uh, part of our podcast on how Democrats can win back majorities in the House and the Senate, maybe the presidency in 2026 and 2028. And I have to tell you up front, I'm not holding out a lot of hope for this. I think one of the things, to be honest, the Democrats should do, probably the first thing they should do, is rename their party, because just the word Democrat these days carries such a negative connotation with so much of the electorate that the only thing that's polling worse these days than Trump and his policies are Democrats. Uh, Democrats are associated with all kinds of bad things, and mostly all the failures of government and all the ways in the last 25 years or so that government has basically failed the people. I think Democrats are seen as the defenders of government and the institutions of government, and sort of the status quo and the way things were for a long period of time, which didn't work for most people. The way things were made most people poorer and made rich people richer. So for Democrats to win back folks that they're going to need to form a winning coalition, they're basically going to have to get back people who are incredibly disaffected and disillusioned with government. They just do not feel that government works for them. And as the defenders of government and the government institutions, that puts Democrats in a pretty lousy position, because whatever policies they come up with, whatever ideas they have, is tainted by their name, Democrat or liberal, and is also tainted by the fact that I think people are aware that in order to get those policies enacted, Democrats not only need majorities, but they have to get people to buy into the idea that government can actually help them instead of just hurting them. And that goes against the last quarter century of people's direct lived experience. So that's the first battle that Democrats have to fight and win if they're going to really win back majorities, is they have to win back some of the disaffected, some of the people who've experienced firsthand the lack of support that they get from the government, even when Democrats are in power, which they have been periodically over the last 25 years. But during that time, people's lives haven't gotten better, and the rich have been getting richer, and the poor and the middle class have been struggling. So one of the reasons that Trump was able to win the majorities he did is he convinced people that although he was running under the Republican ticket, he wasn't your everyday Republican. Because people blame Republicans as much as they blame Democrats, I think, for the problems that we have in this country. It's just that when Trump ran as a Republican, he ran as a outside Republican who wasn't beholden to Washington interests and who was willing to basically tear everything down and use extreme measures in order to make things better for people, or at least make things different. He was willing to really just ignore institutions and rules and regulations and even laws to just get things done. Now, in his first term, I'm talking about Trump now, in his first term, some of the things that he got done, people saw as positive things. They felt that things were more peaceful, they got a tax break, make their lives a little better economically. And until the pandemic hit in the last year of Trump's presidency, I think most people were experiencing that presidency as decent for them. And, they experienced Trump as both entertainment, because he was entertaining, and also kind of a breath of fresh air in that he was not only willing to say things that other people weren't willing to say, but he was willing to really push hard on institutions and laws and regulations that hadn't been working for people in order to actually make things happen. So he was seen as an agent of change, as an agent of advocacy for people who didn't have a voice. And people appreciated that, So even though he was running as a Republican, he was not a Republican. And in fact, in his campaign in 2016, he eviscerated the the quote unquote institutional Republicans and that whole group. Jeb Bush and Romney and all these people who were seen as sort of just standard bearers for a party that wasn't really helping people. Trump just barreled through them, insulted them, mowed them down in his campaign, and presented himself as a change agent, somebody that, although he's called a Republican, would actually just wipe out everything and everyone who stood in the way of his people. Now, I don't think the Democrats have anyone running like that. The closest person in their party who's probably to that really is who actually has run for president is someone like Bernie Sanders, who, although he doesn't have Trump's attitude and way of just mowing people down in his path. He has been very steadfast in his pretty far left liberal views and in fighting for those things to happen. He hasn't really been that successful, but for 50 years or however long he's been in politics, he has never changed his beliefs, never changed his focus, and has always advocated for the policy changes like Medicare for all and getting big money out of politics, etc., that he still advocates for. So he's been very consistent. So I think people like Bernie because of that. He's not a great speaker, he's not charismatic. He's a very old man now, but he's very, very consistent in his beliefs. His beliefs are outside of the Democratic mainstream in the sense of they're more visionary than you get from a typical Democratic bureaucrat. And he's been very, very consistent in his strong support and vocal support for these ideas his whole career. But there's no one on the Democratic side who's really that much like Trump, in the sense of that you get the sense they'd be willing to really fight hard on behalf of their liberal ideals, in the sense, really like ignore regulations, ignore laws, try to circumvent roadblocks that have been established in our institutions of democracy in order to just get stuff done. Maybe you could see like AOC doing something like that, but she's not currently running for president and hasn't made any noises about it. So, I think Democrats are at a disadvantage right up front. They're seen as defenders of a system that hasn't worked for the majority of people who aren't rich. And so, the majority of people don't really take them that seriously, in the sense that they see them as more of part of the problem than part of the solution, part of the bad institution and part of something that could actually get around the institution or go through it to get good stuff done. And the Democrats don't have a real spokesperson or leading candidate that I think most people would see as somebody willing to do that for them, like Trump has done that for his people, willing to break norms, willing to get muddy, willing to ignore laws, get around regulations, step on people if they need to in order to get stuff done. So yeah, Democrats are at a disadvantage because people, still see Trump, even though a lot of people don't like some of the things that Trump's been doing in his second term. They still see Trump as, a person willing to go to the mat for them and to break all kinds of rules, insult all kinds of people, and take people to court and do whatever it takes, threaten, cajole, whatever it takes to get stuff done. There's just no one on the Democratic side who projects like that. And so I think that anyone the Democrats would run for high office, particularly for the presidency, would be at a disadvantage because of the way they'd be viewed as a standard bearer of the Democratic Party and the expectations of them as a standard bearer. In a weird way, Trump has put Democrats in a bad position, even when he does bad stuff. Because he advocates and so forcefully and steamrolls and gets things done. He really gets things done that most people probably didn't even think possible. Some of the things he's done since he's been reelected, I figured he would go in this direction, but I never thought he would get this far this fast. And, so people still see him as the change agent, even if they don't like all the changes that he's doing. And I don't see anyone on the Democratic side who'd be willing to go that far to get through things that the Democrats care about. Policies, changes that would be meaningful to Democrats and ultimately helpful to people. Democrats make the argument all the time that their policies would be better for the average person, particularly for the average poor middle class person than Trump's policies are. And I think they're almost certainly right about that. But I think most people don't see them as as people who could actually get that done. They may say they want, expanded health care or, this program or that program. But I think most people listen to them and kind of roll their eyes and yeah, we elect them and nothing's going to change, nothing's going to happen because they're not going to be willing to do what it takes to move an institutional bureaucracy out of their way. So as far as solutions go, I think some of it starts with the candidates and the attitude. Mamdani is winning in New York in his race for mayor, for a lot of reasons, but partly it's the way he comes across. He speaks very well. He speaks forcefully. He advocates for changes that seem doable, like, free bus rides for people in New York or, suspending rent increases under rent control. Seems like it would be in the power of the mayor. And he advocates forcefully and repeatedly for those things. He seems like he's willing to do what it takes to get those things done. And when he speaks about them, he speaks very well and he speaks eloquently. So, I think people believe him, and that's why he's been campaigning successfully, but he's making a lot of people in the Democratic Party very uncomfortable, particularly over his, ideas about Israel and the fact that he doesn't like what Israel's doing in Gaza. And actually, a lot of people don't like it, but most candidates on the Democratic side who are very mindful of Jewish supporters, aren't willing to actually say that out loud. So again, this is the timidity of Democrats that people, where they don't seem to have all the courage of their convictions that people are really turned off by. Whereas Trump seems to really have the courage of his convictions, and so people are turned on by that. And when they get a candidate on the Democratic side who does seem to have the courage of their convictions and seems like they would actually forcefully go for that if they were elected, then they do get support, like Montgomery's getting support in New York. So, part of the Democrats' problems stem from their candidates, and particularly the candidates that seem like they're part of the system that hasn't been working for people, or just seem a bit timid in their proposals, in their attitudes. Like, even if they were elected, they wouldn't really fight with the boldness necessary to ensure that their visions come to fruition in the real world. And I think if the Democrats are going to win back seats, they need to start fielding candidates who project that way, who have real visions, and who really seem to have the courage of their convictions, and who can articulate their visions and speak with courage, and some degree of forcefulness without sounding either too pie in the sky Pollyannish or too judgmental or whatever. Another thing is very important, because Democrats have this reputation of not respecting poor folks who live in the Midwest and the South. Democrats do have to be a bit careful about when they start talking to and about people who are from a world that they don't know and don't understand. When Democrats deal with, people who are from different backgrounds, the important thing for them to do is listen, not speak. Not tell people what they're going to do for them, but listen to what they need. Ask them, what can I do for you? How can I help you? And not assume that they know that already. Which isn't to say that they shouldn't have any policies, but I think for Democrats, the attitude is more important than the policy. They need to cultivate attitudes of respect, of care, but of listening before speaking, and it's okay if their policies aren't as fully fleshed out as they might want them to be, as long as they're willing to listen to what, the people really want, and then advocate for that. So I really think attitude is more important than policy, ultimately, on the Democratic side. Now, as far as strategies go, I hear a lot of different things as far as strategizing on the Democratic side. What should we promote a platform? Should we go after Trump and his minions? Which is it more important to have to tell people what we want to do for them and to have a cohesive platform? Is it more important to have the right attitude, or is it more important to just attack on all the terrible things that Trump is doing? And I think one thing that Democrats have really found, particularly after this last election, is just attacking Trump not enough. And attacking Trump's supporters is death, because you need some of them to come over to your side. And if you're going to attack them, they ain't doing that. Even, if you choose to attack this version of his supporters versus this other version, when you attack one, a lot of them see it as attack on one as an attack on all, like NATO Article 5. So, again, you just kill yourself when you do that. I think when Hillary Clinton ran against Trump in 2016, she just destroyed her own campaign when she started bad-mouthing his supporters, the people who she saw as leaning toward him. That just wrecked her campaign. She never should have let words like that escape her mouth, like calling Trump supporters deplorables. That was just political suicide. And so Democratic candidates really have to avoid that. And the truth is, Democratic candidates shouldn't even be thinking that way. Trump has a very broad coalition. He has a lot of different groups that support him for different reasons. A lot of people just support him because of his promises to make their lives economically better. Some people support him because they see him as supporting their racial views. Some people support him because they see him as supporting their religious and moral convictions, like his promise to end legality of abortion nationwide, which he did. Keep in mind that Trump has had a lot of successes in the sense of a lot of the things he promised to do, he did. And he had to run over a lot of folks to do it too. So people admired that. But there's his religious backers, and he really gave them a huge win by packing the Supreme Court with people who were hostile to Roe v. Wade. And his racial supporters, who he's giving them various wins, like his going after immigrants who are non-white and selectively deporting them as opposed to immigrants who actually are white, of which there are a number of illegal immigrants in the United States who are white or look white. So he's got that group. He's got just the economic disaffected. He's got young men who are just disaffected in general. They feel like they're falling behind and no one's supporting them. People are just calling them on the left or just saying that they're bad people and they're responsible for all kinds of terrible things and aren't reaching out and trying to help them when they really do need some help. So again, Trump has a lot of different groups, and he has, of course, the tech folks now mostly on his side because he promises to leave them alone to fashion their tech utopias. And he's got business people on his side because of his very regressive tax policies, which make their bottom lines much better. And he's got oil people on his side because of his disdain for alternative energy and his big support for oil and coal. And so anyway, there's lots of groups that like him for lots of different reasons. But I think one thing most or all of those groups probably share in common is liking him because he doesn't talk like a politician, he doesn't act like a politician, and he gets stuff done even if he has to step on people to do it. So he's a person of action. And everybody likes that. You want a person of action on your side. Reminds me of all those, movies that they come out with where there's, the lone renegade hero who, fights for the underdog by basically shooting everyone who gets in their way. And people love those movies. And so Trump is like the action hero for the disaffected. And it's hard to fight against that. You go against Bruce Willis in Die Hard, or you go against Arnold Schwarzenegger in any number of movies, and you're not going to come out on the right end of that stick. But anyway, Trump's coalition is very broad. It's a lot of different groups who like him. I think they like his personality. They all kind of gravitate to his personality and the way he gets things done as a person of action. But they, their support of him comes from different ideologies and different things that they want to see him do, different ways that they want him to fight for them. So, how would you? I don't think Democrats should ignore what Trump has done. I don't think that should be no part of their campaign, that they should only focus on what they're going to do. But I do think that focusing first on what they want to do and on their vision and on their plan and on their, their actions, I think needs to be done first. But I do think that they need to weave in some anti-Trump stuff, to remind people and that, okay, Trump may be a person of action, but he's he's fighting on the wrong side in the wrong battles. So you can make the case, for example, that Trump has, yes, he's been getting things done, but the things he's been getting done are bad things. He's been selling out. Because one thing people do understand and nobody likes is betrayal. And so you could argue in various ways that Trump has been selling out his own people, the people that supported him. So once he got into power, it turns out that the folks he supports and the folks he disdains are pretty much the same as traditional Democrats or Republicans, that he favors the rich, he supports corporations, he supports billionaires like him, and he pretty much disdains everybody else and sells them out and betrays them ultimately. So if you're looking at him for example, economics, to be your economic savior, if you're not already in the upper echelons economically, he ain't your savior. You're going to be waiting forever for him to come around to your side because he's not on your side. And he's sold you out. Just like he sold out his, investors and business partners in the past. The guy has no loyalty, and that's something you can point out. He ultimately turns on his friends as well as his enemies. You can, I think, play on some of the immorality of the things that he's done, but you got to be careful there because a lot of, particularly his religious supporters, already see him as their moral savior. In that, okay, he may have these flaws in his character, but he did stop abortions in a lot of states. And that was their biggest moral concern. So for people whose biggest moral concern was abortions and what they consider the murder of unborn children, Trump has already saved them. And nothing you can say about his character probably will touch that group or make them think really less of him. Although, to be honest, I would point out in the immorality of some of the things that Trump has been doing, he just had Congress, he arm-twisted Congress just yesterday into passing a rescission bill that takes away $1 billion from our support for overseas health and food programs. And in his big, beautiful bill that he got passed a couple weeks ago, he's taking away food from hungry children in the United States and access to medical care for poor adults. So, you could look at Trump as the savior of one group, but he's also perfectly willing to sacrifice children in his quest to whatever he's doing, to basically, undo anything that liberals like. Just because of personal pique and his personal hatred of liberalism, he is willing to take food literally out of kids' mouths and to allow people overseas to starve to death, to allow them to die from lack of medical care. And I'm not talking about adults, I'm talking about children now. By taking away our food programs and our, anti-AIDS programs that give pregnant women medications that prevent them from spreading HIV to their babies so their babies don't die of AIDS. He took that away from them. And now their babies die of AIDS. So I find it interesting, and this is a point that Democrats, if they're feeling brave, could make. I find it interesting that, there's all this stuff on the far right, on the conspiratorial right, about, some cabal of liberals who like to kill babies or kill children and drink their blood so they'll live forever and all this, or rape children. But the truth is the party that's killing babies in the United States is the Republican Party, led by Donald Trump. That's the baby killing group, because they're literally killing babies and children. They're taking food away from them. They're taking medical care that they need away from them, which is killing them. So yeah, I mean, as far as the Q conspiracies go, we do have a group of leaders that are killing children. It's the Republicans. It's Trump. And if there were any justice in the universe, the Congress people that voted for these rescissions, that voted to take food stamps and food away from kids in this country and overseas, and medical care away from kids overseas, and Medicaid away from people in this country, if there's any justice in the universe, they'll be haunted by the ghosts of the children that they've murdered because of their votes for these policies. They're the party of child murderers. To be honest, I don't know how hard I would push that if I were a candidate, because that's a pretty extreme view and the backlash from articulating that view would be extreme. But, I might at least hint at it. I think I would probably, I wouldn't be able to help myself if I were a candidate. I'd probably say it at some point. Although I doubt it would be good for my candidacy, but you never know. Again, people want bold. Nothing bolder than that. Now, I do think the Democrats should actually develop a cohesive, set of policies that they can advocate. I'm a policy wonk kind of person. I like thinking about tax breaks and tax structures and stuff like that. I mean, that's not anything the average person is going to respond to. I think the Democrats need a good pithy slogan, but I think everything the Democrats do, as far as when they try to articulate how they want to remake America, because Trump articulated a remaking of America and American politics. And I think people like that, even if they didn't, if it wasn't, his policies weren't totally logical, or, they didn't necessarily completely follow what he was saying. But I do think it's important to, as a national party and national candidate, to articulate a vision. What is it you want to see America become that it isn't now? And so, for example, one thing I've thought of is I would like to see America become the solutions country, where we figure shit out. We figure out how to solve problems, right? How to fix things, how to make things better, how to solve our problems in a way that benefits everyone. Poor, middle class, and maybe the rich too. So as far as party slogan goes, I would come up with something like the Solutions Society. We figure stuff out. We make things better. We come up with the new medications. We come up with the new treatments. We come up with the diagnostics. We build stuff that works better. We, if there's a problem, we figure out how to solve it. And that should be the focus of our country, is coming up with solutions. The world faces a lot of problems. There's biomedical problems, there's environmental problems, there's economic problems. We figure out solutions. So I think that's a good focus to have. And toward that end, I would have policies that create a better economic society, more egalitarian one, where everybody pays more fair share and more people are supported by the government, and the government really works for everybody. For example, I would change, tax code a number of ways. One way is I would eliminate capital gains taxes in favor of all taxes are income taxes. See, I think when you favor capital gains over income, that sends a bad message. It makes it seem like people who invest, that they're somehow more important, or their money is more valuable, or what they do is more valuable than people who work for a living. And I think that's a terrible message. So I would not have a separate capital gains tax. I would just have, everything, all income taxed at the same rate, regardless of the source. Although I probably would put in a separate deductible for capital gains so that, people who only make a small amount of capital gains every year, who are small investors, are given a little bit of an advantage, and that they can maybe avoid federal taxes. So, maybe you have separate deductibles for individual income versus, for wage income versus investment income. But otherwise, I would tax all income the same, and with the same brackets. I would raise the bracket for highest income earners individually, just so they end up paying more of their fair share. I would lower the estate tax exemptions, so that the rich don't get away with being able to keep send so much of their money to their offspring without it being taxed. There was a time in the United States when most taxes were actually estate taxes. That was the major federal tax. I think back in the early 1900s. But, so I would lower that, because that really disproportionately favors the rich now. Trump just raised that again in his bill to like $15 million exemption, which is crazy. Another thing I would do is I would change the way business taxes are done completely. Because right now corporations get away with, even corporations that are fantastically profitable, can get away with paying almost no taxes by just incorporating business arms in low tax countries and claiming that, all their sales are from that country or whatever. So I would eliminate that. One way to eliminate that is actually by, instead of taxing profit, you tax revenue. And I would just tax total global revenue at some percentage for all businesses. So that would take away all the incentives for the offshoring stuff. It's like, it doesn't matter where you make your money, who you sell to, where you're incorporated. If you're recognized as a U.S. business, you're going to pay taxes on your revenue. For example, last year, I think Apple Computer had about $360 billion in global revenue. And I'm not sure that they paid any tax at all. Maybe a very small amount. But if you put in a total gross revenue tax, they would have paid very substantial amounts, depending on, of course, the tax rate. But they could have paid like $20 billion, which is much fairer for a company that's making that much freaking money. $20 billion, lot better than nothing to the government. Would have been $20 billion extra dollars to the government. A lot more than, by the way, we're saving in this rescission bill, which is passed. They get all that more from one company. And you always hear the same argument when you talk about revenue taxes as opposed to profits taxes. Companies say, well, if we're not profitable, we shouldn't have to pay any tax. Well, first of all, my feeling is you can solve that problem a couple ways. One is you have a pretty generous deductible on business revenue. So say half a million or $1 million deductible, which means the company's making less than $1 million in revenue total annually don't pay any tax at all. So small businesses or businesses just trying to get going, they're going to be exempt from tax because of the high deductible there. But my feeling is if a company's making millions or billions of dollars every year and isn't turning a profit for a number of years, then, something's wrong with that company. So, if you're going to generate that much revenue within a few years, you should be turning a profit. Otherwise, what are you there for? Might as well incorporate as a nonprofit institution. So, I really like the idea of taxing revenue as opposed to profit. It's easy. First of all, it's easier. It's much simpler. And it takes away all the incentives for offshoring that companies have. So there's no advantage to the company incorporating in the Cayman Islands or in Ireland. The Irish would probably hate this, my idea. Probably want me dead because Ireland gets a lot of revenue from all these companies incorporating there now as a low tax country. But anyway, I think that's a better, fairer system to do it that way. Also, by the way, foreign companies that really aren't American companies, that sell to the American market would also have to pay a gross revenue tax. So for the total amount of sales that they have into the U.S. Though they wouldn't pay our tax for sales that they sell, when they sell to other countries. So, if a French company sells something to Germany, they don't pay our taxes for that. But if a French company sells stuff to the U.S., then they do. I also think we're going to need, if we're going to solve the healthcare issue, if we really want to go to a Medicare for all, which I do, I want to get employers out of the business of trying to find healthcare policies for their employees, and I want to get the government into that business so that they can properly negotiate things like drug prices, on behalf of everyone in the U.S., so we can really get these prices and costs down. So I, like Bernie, want to see a real Medicare for all system. You can keep some private insurance companies around for like gap insurance for stuff that the Medicare for all doesn't cover. But otherwise, I want to see the government be the primary insurer. And when you talk about that, of course, everyone screams socialism. But the truth is we already have a heavily socialized medical system. I mean, with the 100 plus million people that are already on Medicare and Medicaid, which are essentially government insured systems. I think we do have to educate people a little bit on the difference between socialized medical care and socialized medical insurance. I want to see socialized insurance. I don't want to see socialized care. I don't want the medical schools and the hospitals run by the government. That I do not want to see. I want those to be private institutions, mostly. I mean, some of them can be public, but I want them mostly as private. But I do want the insurance to be socialized. So there's a difference. You can socialize the insurance policies, make essentially the government the insurer of people, without socializing the medical care, without making doctors go to government institutions to train, or having all hospitals, owned by the government. I don't think that's necessary, and I don't think it's wise either. So, I think a little bit of education there, and especially pointing out that, probably, I don't know what the actual percentage is. I could look it up, but maybe 50% of people in the United States are already covered under socialized medicine. They already have some form of socialized medicine in the form of Medicare, Medicaid. So it wouldn't really be that big a change, but it would require some new revenue. Even with the cost savings of having essentially a single national insurer be the government that can negotiate medical costs down, which would save a lot of money. But even with that, if you're going to insure everybody under that system, you do need some extra revenue. So we'd have to increase government revenue, which means basically increasing taxes of one sort or another, or reducing benefits, other benefits. So I am in favor of, for example, a national health tax, which could cover, essentially the difference here. And, the national health tax would be paid by individuals, but also by companies. So companies wouldn't be totally out of the insurance game. They would be paying money into the insurance pool, but they wouldn't actually have to, find policies for their employees, or negotiate policy prices or anything like that. That would be the government. So businesses would still be involved in the sense they'd be paying to the system, but it wouldn't be their primary responsibility to do the kinds of stuff in health insurance that they have to do now. They wouldn't have to get policies for their employees. Okay, so those are kind of my ideas. Again, it starts with better candidates and, candidates who seem to be people of action as opposed to people of policy or, people who are of the institution, which doesn't seem to be working for most people. You need an overarching theme, and I do think the solution society is a good theme for the Democrats. I think most Democrats would support that idea. You do need, I think, some policy ideas, and I've put some out when it comes to, taxes and Medicare for all and stuff. Another one of the big ones, of course, is finding ways to get big money out of politics, to get billionaires and corporations out of financing political campaigns. And that's a trickier one. I know Bernie has a lot of good ideas for that one, and other people have come up with some good ones too, but probably involves eliminating super PACs or anything like that, and limiting campaign donations from individuals. Personally, I would, if I really had my druthers, I'd eliminate the ability of corporations to contribute, but I'm sure that would be struck down by the Supreme Court, since they've already decided corporations are basically people with lots of money and have the same rights as regular folks. To me, if a corporation has the same rights as regular folks, it should have the same responsibilities as regular folks, which means you should be able to try corporations and put them in prison. But I don't know how we're going to do that. I would also, of course, come up with a more sensible immigration policy. Everybody's in favor of deporting criminals who are here illegally. Nobody supports that. Nobody supports, keeping criminals here. But I do think that people who are undocumented, who are here illegally, but who've been acting legally as good citizens, working jobs, paying taxes, I think they should be given some kind of path to citizenship. During which time, as long as they keep their nose clean, they can't be summarily deported. So I would make the whole immigration thing much more humane. And I wouldn't bother with constructing a whole separate prison system to intern, people we want to deport. The bottom line is America needs these workers. We need these workers. We need them. And we need, quite frankly, fresh blood, because our native population is aging and not having that many kids. So, our native population is doomed to wither and die, taking our country with it, unless we do get that fresh immigrant blood, which we need very, very badly. So, my policies would basically be, as far as these are just basic policy ideas, and I think a lot of Democrats already really support these ideas, and some of them support them quite vocally. So I don't think there's anything radical about, the ideas I would propose, except maybe the corporate revenue tax. But it's really less about, I think, the policies than about the overarching theme. How do these policies fit together to change America in a way that most people would want to see it changed? And then, ways to discredit Trump without making that the first thing that's out of your mouth, and ways to, and the kinds of candidates you need to stand up in order to really start winning elections. More Mamdani types. So anyway, those are my ideas for solutions for a way forward for the Democratic Party. I do again wish they could change their name to some other kind of party, because Democrat has such a pejorative connotation now. It's so many people, when they hear the word Democrat, they immediately go, "Ew." So it would be nice if they could just change that name, and who knows, maybe they will. Okay, so that's it for me for this podcast. Thanks for listening. I hope it made some kind of sense, and I'll see you soon, I hope.